And before we do that, let's do a quick review. Put these vertebral regions starting with the most superior at the top and the most inferior at the bottom. So these are the results and how many got correct. So it looks like 84% of you got correct. Again, this is just like our vertebrae, our spot segments of the spinal cord follow the same. Again, back to our regions. So just like our vertebrae, our spinal cord and spinal nerves have regions. So we have 8 cervical spinal nerves that innervate or lead to and from the cervical region, then thoracic, then lumbar, and sacral. And then the coccygeal, this is the spinal nerves. The thing about the spinal cord, it actually ends right here, and I will get to that real quick. All right. So here's what the spinal cord looks like, and notice that this spinal cord is a thick neural tissue, and then it tapers off here. So we're looking at the side view, we're looking at the sagittal view. And all these branches here are those spinal nerves, and again we have a cervical, we have a thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. And you might be like, what are these weird butterfly shell pumpkin looking things? And these are segments. So if you took the spinal cord and cut it this way horizontally and looked at them, this is what we would see, these cross sections. Now, am I going to show you just like the vertebrae and say, okay, this is a cross section of the spinal cord, where did it come from? I think this one is a little too detailed and not high yield enough to test on, so I'm not going to ask you like, does this look, is this, just show you this picture and ask you, is it thoracic, cervical, lumbar, sacral? I'm not going to ask you that. I'm more concerned with like general structures you see on the spinal cord. So things you can see at multiple regions. Now, just before we talk about more about the different regions of the spinal cord, we have the cervical enlargement. So it's really subtle and difficult to see. And maybe you can zoom in. Yeah, it's very subtle, but there is an enlargement. So the cervical enlargement is where a lot of spinal nerves, so you actually have a lot of nerves leading to and from the cervical enlargement. And why is that? Well, think about, even though I don't have you memorize the roots of the cervical and brachial plexus, the brachial plexus has a lot, especially the inferior part, like remember like C, or I'll just give it to you, C5, 6, 7, 8, and thoracic. So right here is where a lot of the nerves and branches that lead to and from the cervical or brachial plexus will lead to. So the cervical enlargement is from all the nerves that supply and innervate your upper limbs. So this is why it's a little bigger there, because there's a lot of activity that has to lead from your upper limbs to your spinal cord. There's also a lumbar enlargement. And why is that there? Well, if the cervical enlargement is due to all the nerves leading to and from your upper limbs, the lumbar enlargement is for your lower limbs. So that's what we see here. And then the lumbar enlargement, just below that, we see what we call that conus medullaris. So the conus medullaris, that is a tapering off of the spinal cord towards a little point. So the main body of your spinal cord actually it's not the same thickness all throughout. It does taper off near the end. So conus sounds like cone, so referring to that tapering off. So the main spinal cord does not reach all the way to the tailbone and coccyx. So it tapers off superior to that. So it actually tapers off in terms of adults. Well, when we're newborns, it actually starts off at around the same level as the L3 vertebra. But when we mature and grow in height and our vertebral column lengthens, our spinal cord doesn't catch up with that. So the spinal cord so the vertebral column lengthens, and so what happens is that spinal cord starts to rise because our vertebral column lengthens out. So even though it starts out lower when we're born, as we mature, it starts to drift upwards due to our bones growing in length and thickness. Now, just inferior to the conus medullaris is that we have all these stringy structures, and these are our branches of our spinal nerves. And our spinal nerves, this bundle right here, all these spinal nerves in the lumbar and sacral area, this forms all this part, central part right here is called the cauda equina. So this isn't the main part of the spinal cord quite yet. So it kind of looks like this, and you might be like, ooh, it looks kind of like, so this is, if you know your Latin roots, this comes really handy. So caudal means tail, and equina is that same it has the same root word as equestrian. So equestrian sports, like, like that when the Olympics, when you see like them like making those horses prance around or jump over fences, they're called equestrian because equus refers to horse. So basically it's saying horse's tail or like a ponytail, but really gross ponytail maybe you haven't washed. But yeah, that's the cauda equina. It looks like a horse's tail because of all this like cords that are our spinal terms, our spinal nerves. And then it ends up with the phylum terminale. So phylum sounds like filament. So filament is a sort of thread, and terminal refers to the end of something, right? So where it ends up right here is this phylum terminale that ends up attaching the spinal cord to and anchoring it to the coccyx. So the spinal cord, the main body tapers off here and ends up in this ponytail and ends up with this terminal filament. Now, over here, common structures of the spinal cord. Again, I'm not going to show you just a cross-section and ask you to identify which region it's from. I will ask you about common structures you can see on all of them. So what we have here, and actually to orient yourself, this would be at the top of the slide, this would be the posterior of the spinal cord, and this would be the anterior portion. So what we have here is a sulcus. So sulcus in general is just like the bone marking, is a shallow groove. And what we have is the posterior median sulcus. And I love this one because it tells you exactly where it is. It's on the posterior of the spinal cord. It's right down the middle, and it's a shallow groove. So it is like it's not completely solid all the way through. There is a thin line. Now on the anterior, we see the big fissure. So notice that this part right here, compared to the sulcus, which is pretty thin, now it's a little wider, and this is what we call a fissure. So this is the anterior median fissure. So you see this all along the spinal cord. So the posterior median sulcus, you see it all along the posterior of the spinal cord, same with the anterior median fissure. And then over here, we have something called the central canal. So that white spot right here, this is a space and it's filled with fluid, and we'll get to that hopefully by the end of this lecture. So this is central canal. It's a canal in the middle of your spinal cord. And it runs all the way through these segments as well. Now, things that with the spinal cord, notice that it's different colored. And now I'm going to make it two-tone. So what I'm going to do is desaturate this image, and notice that we have a lighter colored region and a darker colored region. And why is that? Well, this is referring to white matter and gray matter. We didn't get to talk about that in detail yet, but now we'll talk more about that. So white matter is that lighter regions, and notice that in general, the white matter is on the outer regions of the spinal cord, whereas the darker gray matter, this is toward the inside of the spinal cord. So in general, even though there's no section that looks completely like this, white matter for the spinal cord, white matter on the outside, gray matter on the inside. Now, why is that? Well, again, remember our general neuronal anatomy. So neurons have our dendrites, our cell bodies, our axons, and our axon terminals. But if you took a typical neuron and a neuron that has myelin, so myelin is that off-white fatty substance that insulates the axon. So say you have a bunch of neurons and then arrange them like this. Well, the cell body also absorbs light a bit, so this is why the cell body typically looks darker than the axon. The axon, if it has myelin, is wider and narrower and absorbs less light. So the cell body of a cell, of a neuron, which is the thickest part of a neuron, is going to absorb more light than the axon. So this is why we see the gray matter toward the inside of a spinal cord segment or its cross-section, and white matter toward the outer layers. Because why? Well, this gray matter is a collection of all of these cell bodies of neurons, and white matter is the white matter is made up of a collection of all these neurons, the axons of these neurons that have myelin on it. So gray matter on the inside because the cell bodies, at least in the spinal cord, are toward the inside, but all their axons are pointing out from the inside toward the outside. So this is why the white matter is on the outside. And here's what we have, the anterior white column. So we might be like, why is it a white anterior? So all the axons are here, but Okay, we know these axons might be entering and leaving these parts right here, but what about these axons here? Well, this white column is actually a cross-section of fibers that run up and down the spinal cord. So again, we're only seeing one layer of the spinal cord in this image right here. So this anterior white column right here, this is actually a cross-section. So you can have all these axons running up and down the spinal cord over there. Now the posterior white column, again, even though we have neurons exiting and entering at these horns right here, the posterior white column is going to conduct axons along this area right here. And the lateral white column right here, this also are a bunch of axons that run up and down the length of the spinal cord. Now over here we have these horns, and there's an anterior gray horn, and it's kind of hard to see the limits of it, but generally if you look at one half of a spinal cord, say, or cross section, there are kind of three bulges of gray matter in the inside. So the anterior gray horn is right here. So this projection is so that's the anterior. There's also a posterior, and the one that pokes out to the side is the lateral gray horn. And why do I make a big deal about that? Well, just remember that, like, if you like that sad mnemonic, what we have here are the sensory nuclei. So these are cell bodies, and what happens is that from all the spinal nerves that have sensory input, they typically enter dorsals. Again, these afferent fibers, these sensory fibers, they tend to follow the dorsal path and end up here. And what's the difference between somatic and visceral? Again, viscera, that very useful word that means organs, so your internal organs, versus somatic, referring to the rest of your body, like your, such as, like, classic example, like your skin, an external input. Now, motor nuclei, so these are the ones that are going to carry out commands. These are your efferent signals. So these are signals going from your central nervous system, whether it's directly from the spinal cord or from your brain. And somatic, this is the one that innervates your skeletal muscles. So typically these follow the ventral path. And these are the visceral commands, so in this lateral gray horn. So basically the nuclei here are going to send signals that tell your organs what to do.